had a couple of comments on the picture on the board. Carolyn Lewis takes many of my pictures. Hunter Smallwood takes a few more, and some of them are mine. This one Carolyn took. It is a mushroom, and I think it's mud that's on it, but it kind of looks a little bit diseased. Beautiful color, but it looks like it's got some kind of ickiness to it. I think it's mud. But I thought it a terrific picture to discuss or to have as a background for leprosy. How much are you looking forward to leprosy? Like, this is one that's pointed out when you go through the book of Leviticus or Numbers or Deuteronomy, that like you have to discuss stuff like leprosy and I mean, we have medicine now. It's almost an eradicated disease. First, we're not going to talk about Hansen's disease, which is the modern day definition, or when you say leprosy, you're discussing Hansen's disease. And that's not what we're going to talk about, because the definition in the Hebrew, especially for the ancient Hebrew, is any number of skin conditions. It would be pretty much anything you'd go to a dermatologist for today would fall under the umbrella of leprosy. It's broken down in Leviticus chapter 13. So if you want to open up to somewhere, Leviticus 13 is a good place to open up to. The reason it's important for the Israelites is because it's a cleanliness issue, and we'll get there in a minute. But it's also a type. And we'll look at this later in the lesson as well. But whenever you see leprosy, you're going to see sin, or if you see sin, you could relate it back and forth. And they're not interchangeable, but the treatment, the problem, the solution, they work hand in hand with one another. So, Leviticus 13, we're not going to read through. I thought, maybe we'll read some of this or some of that. I just have the breakdown in the handout if you want to look at that. The first 9 verses there, 1 through 8, cover blisters, that is eruptions or things that would open on the skin, that type of skin problem. In verses 9 through 17, swellings. In 18 to 23, boils. 24 to 28, burns. And 29 to 37 is really hard and peculiar. It has to do with itching and hair, like the mange or some other diseases that I'm just not very familiar with. It seems to me like this would be one of them that you'd find a cream for as fast as you possibly could, because it sounds most uncomfortable. In verses 38 to 44 is the discussion of white spots. Depending on your translation, your Bible may actually say leukoderma, which means white spots or spotting of the skin. And the instructions for how to deal with all of those people that would have these things are found in verses 45 to 46. What you do with garments that have these kinds of problems are in verses 47 to 59. And then a big portion of chapter 14 is on the cleansing. So if you want to look up specific ones, maybe relate those to modern day diseases or a problem that we might have or you might have. If you want to look up, eczema is a pretty common thing to have nowadays. You could look it up. I believe that goes under the itching one, but I'm not quite sure how that would go. But you can look and see what would happen to you should you have been an Israelite at this time. The instructions are the same, though, for anyone who has leprosy, and they're covered in Numbers 5, 1 through 4. The general way this works is, if you think you have a spot, you go to the priest. If you're clean, the priest says, the Torah says that these are the instructions. This is not a problem. You're clean. You're good to go. If he looks at it and says, no, this is leprosy, then you go Numbers 5, 1 through 4, and you go outside the camp. You're unclean. But if the priest isn't sure, you go into quarantine for 7 days. Does anyone know what that's like? After 7 days, you have a meeting again with the priest. If he's still not sure, 7 more days of quarantine. And at the end of those 2 weeks, the priest has to make the determination, yes, you are clean, or no, you are unclean. Anyone who is unclean has to go out. Numbers 5, starting in verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command the people of Israel that they put out of the camp everyone who is leprous or has a discharge, and everyone who is unclean through contact with the dead. You shall put both male and female, put out both male and female, putting them outside the camp, that they may not defile the camp in the midst of which I dwell. Already, like I mentioned up front with the ties to sin, like this makes sense for leprosy. You don't want to spread any kind of epidemic or plague or anything among the people, but this works for sin as well, right? God's too holy then to look on sin. He can't dwell with sin. Sin has to go. A statement like this would be repeated in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And that cleanliness is next to godliness, to quote a colloquialism. The basic progression is that you are kicked out. If you are kicked out and you are found unclean, later on when you are healed, it goes like this. Leviticus 13, starting in verse 45, the leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. You don't want to wear your mask over your nose, point right here. It's different. Follow the rules of the law where it applies. But how do you cover the upper lip? It's not a mustache. It would be to take your hand and with the most high finger on your hand to put it over your upper lip. So you're covering your entire mouth. You're also shouting to keep people at 6 feet or greater away, just to use modern terms. But they weren't coming that close. It was literally as far as you could say, you can't come near me. I am unclean. You don't want to be with me. Why? Because then you're going to come hang out with me outside the camp. You can't associate one with the other. So apparently, the CDC did not contact Leviticus 13 to ask for instructions, but we see similar things here. This following this rule restricts respiratory air droplets. By keeping someone at distance, you have no tactile transfer, so there's no touching. There's no breath contamination. This is a full separation of the unclean from the clean. Well, what if you're the inverse? That means that all of the unclean needs to stay over there. I don't even need to breathe the same air as the unclean. This is our attitude to sin. It should be far from us, a long way from us. It should be visible to us, and we recognize that that's not something we're supposed to be any part of. We shouldn't even be in its proximity. And so you can see both sides here and how it plays out. And I think we've had way too good of a demonstration lately on how this principle works. When you get to chapter 14, there is the cleansing and the ritual for cleanliness afterwards. It includes a burnt offering and a sin offering and oil applied. Okay, let's look at the analogy of sin real quick. This is a 3-part way to tie all of these together. I think it's things we already know, but it'd be good to go over it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, starting in verse 4, we see the tie of sin to leaven. These are both symbols, or sin's not a symbol, it's a problem, it's an uncleanness, and the thing that it's tied to here is leaven. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, starting in verse 4, when you are assembled in the name of the Lord Jesus, and my spirit is present with the power of our Lord Jesus, you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, and that you, as you really are, unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. So what's being told here, without the previous context, is The person who's sinning, they need to go. They need to be outside. They need to be away from you. And he says, it's like leaven. If you leave it here, it'll cause a bigger problem. So get rid of it. So you have a tie for sin to leaven. Jesus is already tied, while he was here, leaven to teaching. In Matthew chapter 16, we'll look at verse 6 and then 11 and 12. Jesus said to them, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they understood that he didn't tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so you have sin tied to leaven, and you have leaven tied to teaching. And then the last we'll make is from 2 Timothy chapter 2, and we'll start in verse 15. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. But avoid irreverent babble, for it will lead people into more and more ungodliness, and their talk will spread like gangrene. And here you have the best one of all in tying teaching to leprosy. It's properly translated gangrene, which is death of tissue, necrosis of tissue. It's mistranslated in some versions of the Bible, but the proper word, the word that is used in the Greek, is gangrene. It's necrosis, dead tissue. Stuff that you would go to the priest for. And when you went to the priest, he would say, go quarantine for 7 days. Or he would say, you are unclean. What's being said is, it's unclean, it's got to go. These ties we see all together. Sin is tied to leaven. Leaven is tied to teaching. Here, teaching is tied to leprosy. And you can see them kind of side by side. They do the same thing. They kill you. They eat at you slowly until what you are is just dead. They eat you from the outside in, affecting the heart. So what do? Kicked out. God cannot put up with the sin. In Numbers chapter 2, verse 3 states, putting them outside the camp, that they may not defile the camp in the midst of which I dwell. Lepers were removed from the camp. They can't be a part of what God is. Are you covered in sin? Being covered in righteousness. And we have that song. I didn't think of asking Mikey to lead it. I'm sure he would have. Being clothed in righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. In Matthew chapter 22, the parable is told of the person who goes to the wedding and isn't dressed for it. What they are clothed in is not righteousness, not righteous deeds of the saints. They're not clothed in holiness. What they are showing is defilement. And the king said to the attendants in verse 13, bind him hand and foot and cast him into outer darkness, in the place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This parable doesn't line up super close to the idea of leprosy being tied with sin, but we've already done that. What's being tied here is the being cast out portion. The lepers are to be cast out of the camp because they don't belong with God. God can't put up with them being so close. We looked last week at the righteousness, the holiness of God breaking free of the tabernacle and consuming 250 people. Can you imagine the leper staying in the camp? And the righteousness and the holiness of God breaking free and consuming them. So for their own protection, they're pointed out, it's your sin. It's your skin condition. What we would do well to do is to point out in the similar fashion, it's your sin. It's your sin that's keeping you away from God, and you need to be kept away from God. You're not in the right relationship with Him. He would consume you. You should fix it. So here's the thing. I know I'm a sinner. If I know I'm a sinner, if I know I'm a leper, what do? I'm supposed to be outside of the camp, and I am. I'm away from God. And so I have to submit. What we are told to do, and I'll tie this back into the leprosy in a moment. What we are told to do is submit to God and resist the devil, and he will flee from you. James chapter 4, verse 8 continues, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. In this way, we can cleanse ourselves we can be on the road to recovery for the condition of our flesh, for our sin. And then we can follow the directions that are given in Leviticus chapter 14. We'll actually follow almost the exact same directions. How does that work? Well, let's read the directions. Leviticus 14, starting in verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, this shall be the law of the leprous person for the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the priest. And the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall look. Then, if the case of the leprous disease is healed in the leprous person, okay, are we following along for the sin analogy? If it is that your heart is humbled, okay, that is the leprous person that's looking to be cleansed. Okay, the priest will come out and go, why is it that you are ready? Why have you come forward? Why is it that you want to be right with God? So the examination is going on. We continue in verse 4. The priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 live clean birds and cedar wood and scarlet yarn and hyssop. And the priest shall command them to kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water. He shall take the live bird with the cedar wood and the scarlet yarn and the hyssop and dip them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. He shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed of the leprous disease. Then he shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird go free in an open field. And he who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes and shave off all of his hair and bathe himself in water, and he shall be clean. After that he may come into the camp, but live outside his tent for 7 days. On the 7th day he shall shave off all the hair of his head, his beard, his eyebrows. He shall shave off all his hair, and he shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and he shall be clean. After this he'll go and offer a sacrifice for sin. So, what just happened? Because this is probably the weirdest, in my opinion, ritual that the Israelites had to go through. You have all of these things being done in an earthenware vessel. It's a clay pot, okay, or a pot that's made out of dirt of some kind. Adam is the name of man, named after the dirt. Okay. But an earthenware vessel could also be the symbol of just being in the dirt, being in the ground. You also have water, blood, scarlet yarn, cedar wood, and hyssop. How did they try to give Jesus the wine mixed with gall? He put it on a hyssop sponge and put it up to his mouth. Okay, maybe that one doesn't work. How did the Israelites apply the blood to the doorpost? With hyssop. The cedar wood is, I'm not sure, there is so much speculation. I couldn't get this one straight. Everything from cedar is what was used to make the crown of thorns, which I don't like that one at all, to the cross itself was made out of cedar, which is pure speculation. I think it was just to have some wood at the very least, but there is an element of wood that is here. You have yarn, but it's also supposed to be scarlet yarn. Scarlet yarn would have been what purple robe was made out of, depending on how those colors exactly matched up, whether the purple robe was then made scarlet by the blood of Christ as it was ripped from his back or not. You have water and blood. We'll get to both of those in a minute. But all of the other elements point you toward the sacrifice of Christ on the cross and going into the earthenware vessel or going into the earth. The last two elements are what's in the pot already is the fresh water or living water. It means clean water or taken from a running place. It's just clean water, good clean water, not stagnated and mosquito filled. Clean water and blood, and the blood of the bird. I can't help but think of the Sword and the Stone, the Disney cartoon, with the bird being shaken by Mad Madam Mim. And you stick the bird under the water and then you shake it at the guy 7 times. The bird's got to be thinking, dude, let me go. I just get this image in my head, and I'm trying to make it real and to see what it was that was going on. The torture of this little bitty bird. So the bird, one bird is killed and his blood is used, and then you take this bird and you put these elements in the bowl and you baptize the bird. You sprinkle it on the man and you let the bird go. The bird go in an open field. What's the bird going to do? He's going to get away and go as fast as he can. This allows the leper to go inside the camp. All of these elements point you to Jesus. The difference is Jesus is both the bird that is slain and the bird that is placed into the earth and the bird that is able to fly away. The difference is also that the sacrifices that have to be made after that, the 2 sacrifices that have to be made after that, after the guy is or gal is allowed back into the camp, Jesus is those sacrifices too. The priest shall command them to take him who is to be cleansed 2 live birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop. All of these point us toward cleansing so that we can draw near back into the camp. Why was he kicked out of the camp in the first place? Because that's where God is, and he can't come close. And so with all of these sacrifices and with this ritual, once the person has been trying to show himself clean or disease-free, now I can come back and approach where God is. And I need a sacrifice for my sins, and that's offered when he can come back in. Aren't you glad you don't have to go through that? I'm so glad I don't have to baptize birds in blood. Personally, really glad don't have to do that. Really glad that a sacrifice was offered for me so that none of that is required of me. In Hebrews chapter 9, verse 11, we'll start there. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? If you get nothing else out of the look at leprosy, let's get this one thing. Sin is a problem, and it will eat us away until there's nothing left of us. When desire and sin have conceived, death happens. And Jesus is the sacrifice that we need to wash that disease away, to cleanse ourselves of this flesh-eating problem. If you want to go a step on top of that, how awesome was God that He put in place a way to keep sin from spreading in us by the same way, and giving us this example to look at to say, how do you keep something from spreading? You go to pretty extraordinary, long, detailed, painstaking efforts to make sure that the sin doesn't spread, that it stays contained, and that it can be cleansed. Leprosy is not that much fun. Sin's not supposed to be either. We should thank God for the sacrifice that was made for us to cleanse us from it. If you need to interact with that blood to be cleansed of any kind of sin or problem, or if you need the help of the church, make it known before we leave this evening.